you, and welcome to everyone for being here today. I'm Jessie Butner. I'm the Senior Program Manager at the Honda Center for Human Rights and International Justice. And it is a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Adam Kochanski, who is our inaugural postdoc at the Honda Center, and hopefully the first of many to come in the future. So Adam comes to us after finishing his PhD in political studies at the University of Ottawa. He's a Canadian, so that makes us very happy day to day in our work. His dissertation looked at the influence of domestic politics and asymmetric power relations on local transitional justice processes, mostly focusing on Cambodia and Mozambique, which is the work that he'll share with us today. His work is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which has enabled him to come take this postdoc with us, so we're really grateful to them. I'm just going to go ahead and let Adam get started. We'll talk for about 30 minutes? 30 to 40 minutes. Okay, 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So with that, thank you, Adam.
So thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here today to speak to you about my research, my doctoral project, and also to start, thank you all for coming to listen to my talk, and I really look forward to your comments and your feedback on what is still an evolving project. So to start, I'd like to play a short video which sort of illustrates a little bit this local term that I will be talking about in the field of transitional justice.
The Victim Former Khmer Rouge Dialogue Project aimed to rebuild and understand the fragmented relationship between victims and their direct perpetrators, while also exploring the possibilities of reconciliation within Cambodian society. Although calls have been made for reconciliation from the Cambodian government, victims often wish to receive acknowledgement and an apology from their direct perpetrators. For perpetrators, overcoming cultural obstacles that hinder even the acknowledgement of crimes make an apology difficult to achieve. Shortly following independence from France, conflicts and division throughout the 1960s embroiled Cambodia's domestic politics. After gaining control of the capital Phnom Penh in April 1975, the Khmer Rouge regime plunged the country into one of the worst human atrocities of the last century, with an estimated third of the population perishing in the ensuing genocide. Starvation, forced labor, torture, disease, separation, and loss of family members were common experiences. Although their grip on power ended in 1979, the country continued to be marked by civil war, with some areas of Cambodia remaining victim to such violence throughout the 1990s. Despite the absence of war and years of sharp economic growth, tensions continue to exist at the local level. In many communities, former Khmer Rouge cadres live in close proximity to the same people that suffer directly from their actions. Even more, Cambodian youth believe their elders are either telling them a complete fabrication or exaggeration of their experiences from Cambodia's civil war. With intense nationalism and an overwhelming sense of victimization pervasive throughout the country, asking questions about local Cambodian responsibility beyond a small number of senior Khmer Rouge leaders becomes difficult. Pursuing ideas about how reconciliation should happen at the local level, as well as the national level, hits even more obstacles. In 2010, a population-based survey conducted by the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley, found that a majority of Cambodians, 54%, characterized reconciliation as unity and living together. Nearly 40% understood reconciliation as communicating and understanding each other, and another 27% linked the definition to gentleness and compassion for each other. Only 8% define reconciliation as forgiveness. In the project, dialogue participants included 4 people. 2 villagers were chosen to represent the victims in the community, referred to as grandma and aunt in the following clips. 2 other villagers were chosen to represent the former Khmer Rouge cadres in the community, including a villager referred to as grandpa and his wife, who was a low-level cadre during the Khmer Rouge period. From previous projects, organization staff learned that grandma, aunt, and many others in the community hold grandpa responsible for the death of their family members. Villagers remembered the nights when grandpa and other former Khmer Rouge cadres came in to arrest various villagers, including grandma's husband and aunt's father. Their family members never came back, and their remains were later found in a mass killing site near the pagoda in the neighboring village, where grandpa still lives today.
Cá nó tôi thì chỉ nắm một cái thơ ban đấy, với chúng ta nó nó vi của má nó tôi đấy, tại là chạm man hoặc là cái chó chạm man mò tục luôn cái ba luôn là hôn mà, năng này.
Thấy sắp nghe cái đó là cái
khăn luôn này lắm. Chọc ma rồi con tôi tha con phương không con tôi cũng không của con đó, chúng cô một mẹ luôn luôn.
mà tôi tôm nó tôi yang mắc đây
So really, that video illustrates the sort of turn towards the local that has taken place in the field of transitional justice. That despite the presence of a multi-million-dollar war crimes tribunal in Cambodia, there is significant emphasis in the country to engage local populations, emphasizing the importance of local level knowledge and initiatives on the ground. This turn towards the local is very similar to similar emphasis on local practice in both peace building and international development fields. In many ways, the turn towards the local emerged as a response to growing disenfranchisement with some formal transitional justice mechanisms such as trials and truth commissions in various contexts. So the turn towards local practices was in many ways envisioned as a means to save transitional justice at a time when the International Criminal Justice Project is perhaps more than ever in distress. And we can sort of see this as well in the recent ruling that occurred at the International Criminal Court, where the former president of Côte d'Ivoire was acquitted. Despite many frequent reminders in the literature to not romanticize the local, there continues to be a propensity in the literature and research to look at them uncritically, lauding locally rooted initiatives as being more culturally salient, more cost-effective and expedient than heavy-handed top-down interventions, closer to the victims of mass crimes, and as well that they potentially can facilitate reconciliation in communities torn apart by war, as we saw in that video. But what factors prompted this local turn in both the study and practice of transitional justice? And also, what practical and political motivations undergird these processes? The paper that I'll be presenting today argues that we don't know enough to support many of the strong claims that we make in the literature about the effectiveness of local transitional justice processes, and that greater attention needs to be paid to some of the political and power dynamics that undergird these processes and also have the potential to distort them. So the paper that I'm giving is based on an article that was published recently in International Studies Review. I wanted to emphasize that it's part of a larger book project that's based on my PhD dissertation that builds on 8 months of field research conducted in Cambodia and also in Mozambique. The paper forms the basis for the second chapter of this project, and also touches on some of the preliminary conclusions that will be in the concluding chapter of the book. So very much I welcome any feedback, any comments, any questions, reservations that you may have about this evolving project, because it very much is evolving and revisions are still underway. So just to give a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to start a little bit by talking about conceptual issues, so where the local is, and then I'll move to talking about the sources and the spread of the local turn, both in practice, tracing international, national, and local level developments, and also in scholarship. I'll then pivot towards discussing some of the problems and oversights within the existing literature, and I'm going to end with some concluding remarks and identify several pathways for further research. In case anyone is unfamiliar with what transitional justice means, on this slide I've written down the way that the International Center for Transitional Justice defines this. So, where is the local? This is a topic that I've spent the last 7 years thinking about. As we saw in the video, it's a very complex and messy picture. A central challenge of working on local TJ is that there's a paucity of existing definitions, and also they've been referred to in different ways. So there's no consensus yet on how to define the local. They've been defined variably as bottom-up, everyday, hybrid, grassroots. One of the main challenges of pinning down the term is that there's a lot of multi-level connections and linkages. As we saw with the project in Cambodia, it was sponsored by United States and German donors. It was carried out with the support of local level authorities, but the actual program delivery was carried out by a Cambodian national civil society organization. So very many different types of connections. So rather than, so the way that I like to think about the local is to think about it as a process. So I use the term local transitional justice process to denote practice that's locally based, is informal, participatory, and holistic in nature, and that seeks to address a legacy of human rights violations in the wake of mass atrocity. So what's important to take from that is that I view these initiatives as being dynamic, open-ended processes which span the local, national, and international divides. I don't equate local transitional justice strictly with traditional or customary forms of justice, recognizing that different types of ideas are often imported from elsewhere and adapted to local priorities and needs. But I do situate them as inherently taking place at the subnational level. Whether in villages, whether in districts or communes, there is a specific type of spatial dimension to the way that I like to think about the local and where it's practiced. So what is the genesis of this local turn in policy developments? In the paper, I talk a little bit more in detail about the different types of policy developments that have taken place at all three levels that have prompted this local turn. The first stream is at the international level, where a number of significant developments have taken place. The first major one was the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's report on the rule of law and transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict societies in 2004. Here, the former Secretary General cautioned against the uniform adoption of one-size-fits-all approaches to dilemmas of transitional justice. So only using trials or truth commissions. In fact, he almost gave equal weight to local level practices, stating, quote, "Due regard must be given to indigenous and informal traditions for administering justice or settling disputes, to help them to continue their often vital role, and to do so in conformity with both international standards and local traditions." This shift towards the local also was taking place simultaneously in other important areas of international politics. In international development, in 2005, the Paris Declaration was reached on improving aid effectiveness, and a core tenet of this was emphasis on local participation and agency. Similarly, the 2008 Accra Agenda built on the Paris Declaration principles. In the peace-building literature, in the peace-building policy field, The UN Peacebuilding Commission was established in 2005, also placing a lot of emphasis on local ownership. And the 2011 New Deal for engaging in fragile and conflict-affected states identified local ownership and participation in peace-building processes as an indispensable tenet to peace-building success. Also, the creation of a victim trust fund at the International Criminal Court can further be seen as a part of the sort of institutionalization of the local turn in international policy. This principle has been recognized at the highest levels of UN policy and has created this institutional framework for the idea that local agency and buy-in not only matter, but are required for TJ efforts to succeed. In Stream 2, we see some national policy developments that have taken place, which have sort of driven this turn towards the local. Those of you who are familiar with local level TJ, the best known example are the Rwandan Gacaca Accords, which were established in the early 2000s to tackle the country's massive backlog of incarcerated genocidaires and to deal with its exceptional genocide justice dilemma. It was fraught with controversy. I'll get to that shortly. And the second best known example are the Akoli reconciliation rituals that were used in northern Uganda to cleanse, and they were envisioned to facilitate the reintegration of Lord's Resistance Army child soldiers and also ex-combatants. At the same time, while all of these national and international developments were taking place, there was also a customary law stream bed where continuously before these talks happened for centuries, thousands of years, different types of practices were being used in various communities to heal those who may have had crimes committed against them, to reintegrate combatants, to resolve different types of disputes at the community level that stemmed from some sort of conflict situation. A major impetus for the local turn has also been what I argue and develop in the paper, 3 debates in transitional justice scholarship. So the first major debate that has sort of been a motivating factor for this local turn is a debate about bottom-up versus top-down TJ. So a critique emerged regarding the imposition of mostly foreign models on non-Western societies, whether they be trials or truth commissions, in a uniformly top-down direction. And there was a lot of debate about the purported mismatch of these institutional options and some of the local priorities on the grounds, and also pre-existing conceptions of justice in post-conflict societies. There was also a critique regarding the practicality of these heavy-handed institutional interventions, that they were deemed to be sluggish, expensive, and that they also privileged a legal discourse that was very foreign to the intended beneficiaries of these mechanisms, so the victims themselves. Various scholars argued that by localizing transitional justice, it would be more ready to support the actual priorities and needs of victims because they are embedded in the actual communities where crimes took place. But furthermore, that by promoting bottom-up action, it would activate civil society, encourage the participation of survivors, and make TJ ultimately more meaningful and sustainable in the long run. In many ways, this particular debate is over. It's become axiomatic in the literature, and there is widespread recognition that bottom-up practice is important. The second major debate that has fueled the local turn is one between transformative justice scholars and advocates of transitional justice. And at the center of this particular debate is a critique of the central aims of the field, and in particular the ideological commitments of the Transitional Justice Project to implementing a liberal peace and other types of liberal goods, and also its particular orientation on the establishment of democracy and holding elections in recovering societies, but also the emphasis of the transitional justice field on prioritizing civil and political rights over other types of ends, such as social rights and economic justice. So transformative justice scholars have inter alia advocated a move away from these sort of underlying foundations of the transitional justice field towards a more development-centered model, suggesting that it can help overturn some of the structural sources of violence that existed in a society and that led to the outbreak of violence to begin with. And this was has been a major underlying factor for the local turn as well. A third debate in scholarship that has prompted the local turn is one between advocates of the legal pluralist approach and legalists. And in many ways, this particular critique is over what justice is, and it pits legal scholars and practitioners against social anthropologists and others. Central to this particular debate is the claim that legalist approaches can have negative and destabilizing effects in non-Western societies, and also they could be removed from local conceptions of justice and methods for delivering justice. So advocates of the legal pluralist approach recognize the existence of multiple systems of justice in a given society, and that some sort of mix of formal and informal justice methods hold the key to meeting the full range of needs of victims after a conflict has taken place. So, in the article, the balance of the article, it discusses some of the problems and oversights that exist within these particular debates. And I argue that the normative preferences of local TJ proponents contain different types of systematic biases that have predisposed them to envision a type of local TJ that they want to see, and then to overlook important dimensions. So there are generally 5. I'm going to list them, and then I'm going to discuss each of them in a little bit more detail. But the first blind spot is an overemphasis on responding to due process concerns and questions about their legality. The second is potential danger of reproducing dynamics of colonialism in the promotion of local level transitional justice. The third is insufficient attention to local national power asymmetries. The fourth is a penchant amongst local transitional justice scholars to take domestic political interests at face value. And then the final one is a propensity that continues to pervade to make exaggerated claims about the effectiveness of these mechanisms. So I argue in the paper that these tendencies have predisposed scholars to discuss a version of local justice that they want to see work and to overlook important dimensions. I don't know how much of this you're going to be able to see, but in any case, I'm going to unpack each of those 5 points in a little bit more detail. So on the first point, overemphasis on responding to due process concerns and questions about their legality. This stems in many ways from blind spots in the first and the third critiques, so the bottom-up and top-down, and legal pluralism over legalism debates. So in an effort to justify local TJ, scholars have discussed these mechanisms as a judicial institution and have attempted to evaluate them against criteria meant to ensure fair trial rights. So for example, in Rwanda and in Timor-Leste, A lot of the discussion has focused on the level of technical expertise of the judges, whether participants had fair trial rights, whether there was a defense counsel that was present. All of these different types of things that are envisioned in a formal court setting. And by situating discussions of the local in a strictly legal discourse, in many ways what this did was it depoliticized discussions of them. And it created a disconnect between the way that these mechanisms were being used and the underlying politics that surrounded them. And then the second blind spot that was created by talking about them in strictly legal terms is that by focusing so much on the ways that these local practices can be scaled up to meet international standards, there's a potential risk of losing sight of the actual priorities and needs of victims and what they want from these processes. So the second major blind spot relates to the potential danger of reproducing dynamics of colonialism in these practices. This also stems from the first and the third critiques. So I argue that externally led efforts to refashion traditional legal and governance systems into more recognizable, liberal forms can mask potential new colonial undertones. So two empirical blind spots are that well-intentioned efforts to promote local TJ can exacerbate some of the relationships of domination that undergird the field of transitional justice itself. And I've noticed this in some of my fieldwork in Cambodia, but it's really where actors in the global north are the primary drivers of TJ in communities, while their partners in the global south are treated as passive recipients. So in many ways, local forms of transitional justice are only acceptable if they meet these different types of international legal standards. So it becomes another way of transmitting different types of ideas about justice from a Western liberal core to the war-torn peripheral states of the South. And the second major blind spot is that efforts to revitalize, to reestablish the prominence of certain traditional authorities can have the paradoxical, perhaps unintended consequence of reinforcing, reproducing colonial structures of domination that may have caused the outbreak of violence in the first place. So for example, in both Uganda and Sierra Leone, one of the underlying vectors of both conflicts was that were the tensions between lineage-based elders and armed youth, which prompted certain youth to join, whether it was the Revolutionary United Front or the Lord's Resistance Army. So by rebuilding some of these structures that triggered the outbreak of conflict in the first place, there's a potential risk of renewing some of the original sources of conflict rather than promoting social healing on the ground. The third major issue is insufficient attention to local national power asymmetries. So this mostly stems from a preoccupation in the literature with the national and international levels in the third debate, and also the tendency to treat local actors as a unified group. So going back to the Rwanda court, the Rwandan Gacaca court example, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with Gacaca, these were community level courts that were established around the country. Roughly 12,000 of these courts operated for a decade and adjudicated for about 2 million cases that stemmed from the Rwandan genocide. Initially, the courts were hailed as a very innovative, homegrown solution to Rwanda's genocide justice dilemma. And many of the early works on the Gacaca courts really focused on the extent to which these community courts met fair trial rights, met international standards. What many overlooked during this period was the extent to which the central government in Rwanda carried influence over local authorities, and the ways that the process was steeped in unequal distributions of power. So in one anthropologist's words, under Gacaca, the truth was in the first place curtailed by an a priori definition of the parameters of what the truth could be. So in practical terms, what this meant was that throughout the Gacaca proceedings, any discussion of, for example, Rwandan Patriotic Front war crimes were off limits. And also any discussion of non-Tutsi lived experiences during the genocide were also off limits, thereby reinforcing a version of reconciliation that suited the needs of the ruling party and even consolidated its power. There's also a penchant in the literature to overlook some of the underlying political motivations that drive these practices. In Uganda, for example, many locals initially wanted traditional measures, and they wanted the promotion of amnesty in the country in order to end the conflict and to promote peace in northern Uganda. And the government was at first opposed to these practices and preferred referring the case to the International Criminal Court. However, when the Museveni regime realized that by referring the case to the court, that some members of the government or the armed forces could potentially be implicated in the ICC investigations, the government all of a sudden made an about-face in favor of local practices. So what's likely is that the Museveni regime concluded that local TJ and some of these equity reconciliation rituals were less consequential than referring the LRA case to the ICC. And this is why traditional practices likely became a cornerstone of the Juba peace talks between Lord's Resistance Army and the Museveni government. The last point relates to this propensity to make faith-based claims about the effectiveness of local practices. And largely this falls on, I think, transformative justice scholars' efforts to frame local TJ as an alternative to a sort of Western liberal discourse and Western liberal transitional justice project. So blinded a little bit by this optimism, the literature, in fact, leaves many questions unanswered. So we don't know to what extent local TJ is actually effective. We also know little about whether there are any identifying patterns and trends across different regions, cultures, and political contexts, and also whether specific types of local level interventions are more or less likely to reveal the truth, to deliver justice, and what the record is of disparate approaches. So the concluding section of the article identifies an avenue for further research, and it discusses 3 potential avenues that would further expand our knowledge about the way that these local practices are being used. So the first research avenue relates to a need to identify some of the underlying causal mechanisms that enable political interference on the ground in local practices, as well as what some of the factors might be that can offset the potential for political interference. So is political interference in local practices merely a function of authoritarianism, or are there other causes at play? So I suggest that in order to tackle this particular issue, Scholars first need to recast their preconceptions of local, national, and international actors as passive actors into political agents in their own right, and particularly local actors, to reconceptualize local actors as active agents who have their own interests in these processes, and that these interests might not always align with those at the national level or of the international community. I also argue for the need for carefully selected cross-national and or within-country qualitative comparisons to identify differences in local justice successes and failures. One exceptional study is Adam Moore's study of local peace-building outcomes in two Bosnian towns, Brčko and Mostar. By comparing these two particular contexts, he identifies that different localized peace-building dynamics is actually what prompted Brčko to become a peace-building success story, whereas Mostar has faltered. So this type of cross-national comparison could provide valuable insights into when conditions are suitable to promote local practices, and also to specify the different roles that bilateral actors could play in working with different categories of actors to ensure that justice is actually delivered locally. Second, there's a need for greater systematic inquiry into the impact of local TJ. So I'm not advocating statistical analysis of local practices because in order to understand how these processes work, it requires fine-tuned and in-depth research. So actually what is particularly useful would be collaborative cross-national research, engaging country experts on diverse contexts. So one of the blind spots in the literature generally is that many of the studies on local TJ focus on Rwanda, Uganda, and certain other African nations. There is a need for cross-national research that looks at the uses of local transitional justice across disparate settings, partly to identify whether political interference is, again, more of a regional phenomenon or whether it has more widespread traction. There's also an opportunity for survey research and for field experiments. And this could be useful at both the design and the evaluation phases. So the opening video, it mentioned some of the population-based surveys that Berkeley's Human Rights Center has conducted. These types of surveys are useful at the design stage to identify both what pre-existing local conceptions of justice are, but also what some of the victims of mass violence actually want and desire. Is there more of a general will to punish in a society or to forgive, to remember or to forget? What are the priorities and specific demands of victims on the ground? And how can this be translated into both local level transitional justice mechanisms, but also how can they inform the design of national level institutions, whether it's a national level truth commission or some of the outreach mechanisms of trials. There's also an opportunity for micro-level analyses, whether it's the work of Aaron Baines or Karen Bruneas, where by working one-on-one with different types of victims who have participated in different types of local practices, they've generated vivid personal oral histories of their experiences, which can help inform the extent to which they found these practices actually meaningful. And finally, more research is needed to determine how widespread and influential local transitional justice is as a global phenomenon, and also to specify what the relationship is between local level practices and national level ones. So here I'm talking about the development of a qualitative cross-national data set where there are vivid and rich descriptions of different practices that are being used worldwide. But also I'm advocating for the utility of different types of GSI-enabled mapping projects, which are already well underway in Cambodia and quite extensive. But these types of mapping projects can be very useful, for example, in the other country that I studied, which is Mozambique, where very little is known about the locations of mass graves, or the types of local level memorialization efforts that exist around these mass graves. And the second point related to this question of the relationship between local level TJ and national level instruments. So, to what extent do these two practices complement each other? How can they be effectively sequenced? What is the specific timing? These are all questions that for the most part until now remain unanswered, and would provide crucial insights into designing effective transitional justice in post-conflict societies. So to end, I wanted to start with a personal anecdote that before beginning my PhD, I was very much an optimist about local level transitional justice approaches, and that's sort of what drew me to the field. I saw this sort of disconnect between national level mechanisms and a lot of the priorities that were on the ground. And I did sort of see the local turn as being this almost like silver bullet panacea. I was extremely hopeful. And as my research progressed, I started to see many of like the same political and power dimensions at work that plagued a lot of these top-down interventions. The article and the project more generally, I don't want it to be read as a sort of dismissal of local TJ prospects. In some ways I am also hopeful, still hopeful. However, it is meant to serve as a cautionary note against the wholesale promotion of these efforts, given the lack of empirical evidence that we currently have about both their promise and perils. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I'm glad to hear you at least still have some hope so that we can move past the PhD tagline of turning optimists into pessimists. But I do think your starting question about sort of what is the local is so important, particularly in any sort of human rights or international justice field, because this turn towards the local, like you said, is a much bigger phenomenon than just with relation to transitional justice processes. And I'm always like baffled by how one becomes an expert in a place, like someone's suddenly an expert in East Africa because they've done 2 years of field work there, and I'm like, I would never proclaim expertise in like American political systems, even though I've participated in them my whole life. So thank you for elucidating that.